Hey, crew. It's Pitt, and I'm back with some more psychology. Today, we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Ion. We are going to be reading aloud from the self first and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue the exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the box down below so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. If you find value, I ask that you do all of the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that is stated, put it in the box, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly find value, I ask that you hit the super chat or super thanks. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of one of my books. They're all pretty relevant today. And so, with that being said, let us dive in and continue our exploration of Eon with Chapter 4, The Self. We shall now turn to the question of whether the increase in self-knowledge resulting from the withdrawal of impersonal projections, in other words, the integration of the contents of the collective unconscious, exerts a specific influence on the ego personality. To the extent that the integrated contents are parts of the self, we can expect the influence to be considerable. There are assimilation arguments, not only the area of the field of consciousness, but also the importance of the ego, especially when, as usually happens, the ego lacks any critical approach to the conscious, to the unconscious. In that case, it is easily overpowered and becomes identical with the contents that have been assimilated. In this way, for instance, a masculine consciousness comes under the influence of the anima and can even be possessed by her. Let me do that real quick. Okay. I have discussed the wider effects of the integration of unconscious contents elsewhere and can therefore omit going into details here. I should only like to mention that the more numerous and more significant the unconscious contents which are assimilated to the ego, the closer the approximation of the ego to the self. Even though this approximation must be a never-ending process, this inevitably produces an inflation of the ego, unless a critical line of demarcation is drawn between it and the unconscious figures. But this act of discrimination yields practical results only if it succeeds in fixing reasonable boundaries to the ego and in granting the figures of the unconscious, the self, anima, animus, and shadow, relative autonomy and reality of psychic nature. Now, I look at this, right? The self is the sum of all four. You have the ego, which is the choosing conscious part, the soul. Then you have the change agent, which is fire, and that is the anima, the stasis agent, which is water or feminine, and is the animus, and the shadow is kind of like the superconscious. That's about right. Uh, because these are really four different aspects of things, I'd label them a little bit differently, and so I just want to make that clear as we go before we really go along. Uh, okay. To psychologize this reality out of existence either is ineffectual or else merely increases the inflation of the ego. One cannot dispose of facts by declaring them unreal. Boy, is that ever a true thing. The projection making factor, for instance, has undeniable reality. Anyone who insists on denying it becomes identical with it, which is not only dubious in itself, but a positive danger to the well being of the individual. Everyone who has dealings with such cases knows how perilous an inflation can be. No more than a flight of steps or a smooth floor is needed to precipitate a fatal fall. Besides the pride goeth before a fall motif, there are other factors of a no less disagreeable psychosomatic and psychic nature which serve to reduce puppetness. This condition should not be interpreted as one of conscious self aggrandizement. Such is far from being the rule. In general, we are not directly conscious of this condition at all, but can at best infer its existence indirectly from the symptoms. These include the reactions of our immediate environment. Inflation magnifies the blind spot in the eye, and the more we are assimilated by the projection making factor, the greater becomes the tendency to identify with it. A clear symptom of this is our growing disinclination to take note of the reactions of the environment and to pay heed to them. It must be reckoned a psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. The image of wholeness then remains in the unconscious, so that on the one hand, it shares the archaic nature of the unconscious, and on the other, finds itself in the cyclically relative space time continuum that is characteristic of the unconscious as such. Both these qualities are numinous and hence have a unlimited determining effect on the ego consciousness, which is differentiated, in example, separated from the unconscious, and moreover exist in an absolute space and an absolute time. It is a vital necessity that this should be so. If therefore the ego falls for any length of time under the control of the unconscious factor, its adaptation is disturbed and the way open for all sorts of possible accidents. Hence, it is of the greatest importance that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by very precise adaptation. For this, certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience, etc., are of great value on the moral side, just as an accurate observation of the symptomology of the unconscious and objective self criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. I agree, right? Now, I frame these very specifically, right? I have 8 real checkpoints that you can balance for yourself. Now, I do that through energetic manipulation. That is too much for some people, but you can do it just by considering the concepts. You don't have to do the meditation and the energy movement, right? Lust and chastity, or anger and wrath. Wrath and love is the first one, right? And the balance between those is going to be kindness. Now, you can overextend into wrath. You can fly off the handle and harm someone, or you can overextend into love. You can give love to the person who is absolutely undeserving of love. Narcissist relationships is a good example. This is a person who is in love with themselves. They are not in love with you, but you extend your love to them, even though it is toxic, into your life. That is an overextension of love. That is love without bounds and without reason. Right? You can overextend into the virtues. And the balance between those is going to be kindness. It is great to show love to those who show love to you. It is better to show kindness to everyone until they show that they love you in return. Always show them kindness because they are deserving of kindness. That is the law, right? Treat others as you would be treated. That was the law, the golden rule. The whole of the law summed up into one. And so that really is the beginning point, the very first step. And then the next step is to balance your lust and your chastity. Right? The exact same thing. You can overextend either one. And you are meant to have sex, just not with everyone. The balance is sacred union. But that's also your relationships in general, not just sexual. I mean, that is all of your interpersonal relationships. You can overextend with not doing relationships, and you can overextend with having too many relationships, even if it's not of a sexual nature. And the balance is to do that in union so that everybody has a positive aspect to it. Everybody is growing from it equally, right? Equally is a big word, but fairly equally, right? You're not trying to drag up the anchor. You're all sailing along. Nobody's away above somebody else where they can't be reached. Everybody's fairly equal, right? And everybody is equal, but in aspirations. But that's the second balancing point. And then you move up and it's consumption, right? Gluttony and moderate, or gluttony and denial, right? Eating too much, not eating enough. Both are possible. The balance is moderation. The next step up, greed and charity. You can absolutely be in love with money. That is the root of all evil. Or you can give it away way too much. that is equally detrimental to your well being. You are meant to have things, but not all of the things, and you should be able to lose anything. Gratitude is going to be the balance point. Right? Next up, you got uh, what's next? Pride and humility, right? Overextending into yourself and your value for yourself and not valuing yourself enough. You should appropriately balance yourself and take credit for a job well done, realizing that it doesn't make you better than anyone. Then you got sloth and diligence, right? You can work too hard or you can not work nearly enough. And the balance is patience, doing the correct thing in the correct time. Hope and despair. You can be too hopeful without a sense of reality. You can be too despairing, not realizing that things are actually going well. And the balance is faith that the correct step, the next best thing, will lead to the correct outcome. Having faith in the plan, even if you can't see the end of the plan, taking the next correct step. And then finally, you got self and source. Too much into yourself and too much into your source. Too much into yourself is that narcissist that I was talking about earlier. And too much into source is the people that blow themselves up because God told them to. Whoever they are, and there's a whole lot of them out there. Zealotry is a bad thing, right? Unreasonable expectations from God is a bad thing. You are putting something outside of what you should be taking responsibility for. That's a bad thing. But you should believe that there is a God because look around you. We have been created. That doesn't mean that he's sitting up there on the throne waiting to judge you. I don't know. I don't believe that, but he might be. The point is that there is a balancing point for all of these things. You can't overextend into any of these things. And that's what this is, right? Certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience are of great value on the moral side. That is true. Just as accurate observation of symptomology on the unconscious side, right? That is the balancing, right? That's not saying it in the same way that I just did, but that is what it is saying. However, accentuation of the ego personality and the world of consciousness may easily assume such proportions that the figures of the unconscious are psychologized and the self consequently becomes assimilated to the ego. Although this is the exact opposite of the process we have just described, it is followed by the same result inflation. The world of consciousness must now be leveled down in favor of the reality of the unconscious. In the first case, reality had to be protected against an archaic, eternal, and ubiquitous dream state. In the second, room must be made for a dream at the expense of the world of consciousness. In the first case, mobilization of all the virtues is indicated. In the second, the presumption of the ego can only be damped down by moral defeat. This is necessary because otherwise one will never attain that median degree of modesty, which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. It is not a question, as one might think, of relaxing morality itself, but of making a moral effort in a different direction. For instance, a man who is not conscientious enough to make a moral effort in order to come up to the mark, while for one who is sufficiently rooted in the world through his own efforts, is no more small moral achievement to inflict defeat on his virtues by loosening his ties with the world and reducing his adaptive performance. One thinks in this connection of Brother Klaus, now canonized, who for the salvation of his soul left his wife to her own devices, along with numerous progeny. Since real moral problems all begin where the penal code leaves off, their solution can seldom or never depend on precedent, much less on precepts and commandments. Any real moral problems spring from conflicts of duty. Anyone who is sufficiently humble or easygoing can always reach a decision with the help of some outside authority. But one who trusts others as little as himself can never reach a decision at all, unless it is brought about in the manner in which common law calls an act of God. The Oxford Dictionary defines this concept as the action of uncontrollable natural forces. In all such cases, there is an unconscious authority which puts an end to doubt by creating a fait accompli. In the last analysis, this is true also of those who get their decision from a higher authority, only in more veiled form. One can describe this authority either as the will of God or as an action of uncontrollable natural forces, though psychologically it makes a good deal of difference how one thinks of it. The rationalistic interpretation of this inner authority as natural forces, or as the instinct, satisfies the modern intellect but has the great disadvantage that the apparent victory of instinct offends our moral self esteem. Hence, we like to persuade ourselves that the matter has been decided solely by the rational motions of the will. Civilized man has such a fear that the crimen lese majestis humanae that, whenever possible, he indulges in a retrospective coloration of the facts in order to cover up the feelings of having suffered a moral defeat. He prides himself on what he believes to be his self control and the omnipotence of his own will, and despises the man who lets himself be outwitted by mere nature. If, on the other hand, the inner authority is conceived as the will of God, which implies that natural forces, or divine forces, our esteem is benefited because the decision then appears to be an act of obedience, and the result a divine intention. This way of looking at it can, with some show of justice, be accused not only of being very convenient, but of cloaking moral laxity in the mantle of virtue. The accusation, however, is justified only when one is, in fact, knowingly hiding one's own egoistic opinion behind a hypocritical facade of words. But this is by no means the rule, for in most cases, instinctive tendencies assert themselves for or against one's subjective interest, no matter whether an outside authority approves or not. The inner authority does not need to be consulted first, as it is present at the outset in the intensity of the tendencies struggling for a decision. Most of the time, you already know what decision you should make, right? When you are being presented, you know which one, and if you don't think that that's the right one, you will try to convince yourself for a variety of reasons why it's not. And if you think that it is, or if you want it to be, you will convince yourself that it is. But that first instinctual reason, most of the time, is going to be the right one. And it is. And that first voice that you hear, that's normally the right one. Normally, that is the voice of growth, the voice of change in a positive direction, as opposed to the voice of don't. And so take that for what you will, right? That is not by any means a definitive of the only way, but generally speaking, and that is not for those people who feed the negative voice, right? If you are intentionally or unintentionally feeding the negative voice, don't, right? Start changing that immediately. But if you are feeding the negative voice, the one of violent response, the one of non alignment, that one will be the first one you hear. And you will know that that's the wrong one, but you will follow it any damn way. All right, thanks to the text. In this struggle, the individual is never a spectator only. He takes part in it more or less voluntarily and tries to throw the weight of his feelings of moral freedom into the scales of decision. Nevertheless, it remains a matter of doubt how much his seemingly free decision has a causal and possibly unconscious motivation. This may be quite as much an act of God as any natural cataclysm. The problem seems to me unanswerable because we do not know where the roots of the feeling of moral freedom lie, and yet they exist no less surely than the instincts, which are felt as compelling forces. All in all, it is not only more beneficial but more correct psychologically to explain these as the will of God, the natural forces that appear in us as instincts. In this way, we find ourselves living in harmony with the habitus of our ancestral psychic life. That is, we function as man has functioned at all times and in all places. The existence of this habitus is proof of its viability, for if it were not viable, all those who obeyed it would have long since perished of maladaptation. On the other hand, by conforming to it, one has a reasonable life expectancy. Yeah. Right. There's a lot of things that I could say here, and I'm just not going to do it. But when an habitual way of thinking guarantees as much as there is, and not only no ground for declaring it incorrect, but on the contrary, every reason to make it as true or correct in the psychological sense. Psychological truths are not metaphysical insights. They are habitual modes of thinking, feeling, and behaving, which experience has proved appropriate and useful. I am not limited by a scientific reputation, so I can say that they are indeed metaphysical insights, right? You were created. I fully and firmly believe that. Your DNA was encoded at that moment of creation. I fully and firmly believe that as well. And so these psychological truths are the way that you think, right? What do you focus on? That is encoded in you, right? The thing, whether it is a thing or an idea, that is encoded in you, right? It is very apparent from a very young age which kids are going to play sports and which ones are not, right? Not necessarily even because of interest, but because of just the way that it happens, right? You can be like, this kid's not a football player, right? Or this kid is, right? This kid absolutely has the talent for playing with the ball, right? That is things versus ideas in a lot of cases. And you can start to see these things emerge very fast. Right? By the age of 8, they are pretty firmly set, right? The way that you see the information through the lens of things or ideas, through the lenses of now or now new or old, through the lenses of tribe and self. That one's a little bit less, right? That is about the time that you start really discerning that particular trait. Or before that, it is mostly self for most kids. By the age of 8, you're starting to discern that there is a tribe and how you will interact with them. And so that one sets a little bit later. The me versus the tribe really expresses itself a little bit later. But all of these things, they express themselves very quickly in the progress of a child. Um, and so they are psychological truths as metaphysical insights, right? The DNA that was encoded, I believe, was encoded by the creator. And so for me, that is one and the same, right? Psychological truths are how you explain the metaphysical insights, right? It's science is the way that God did it. I don't dispute science, right? Except for some points, which are highly contentious. But for the most part, right, I'm fairly trusting of the scientific endeavors of the scientific community at large. There are specific areas where there is definite problems, but for the most part, it's all right. All right. So, anyway, back to the text. So, when I say that the impulses which we find in ourselves should be understood as the will of God, I wish to emphasize that they ought not be regarded as an arbitrary wishing and willing, but as absolutes, which one must learn how to handle correctly. The will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature. And what is suppressed comes up again in another place in an altered form, but this time loaded with resentment. It makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. Right? When you can start making the choices on that checklist that we discussed, if you can start making those choices consciously, it really does make a difference in this part, right? In being, you don't need to suppress them if you have the ability to discern them and then separate them and then choose appropriately. Then you don't have to suppress the emotions. You don't have to suppress the need to express yourself. You can do that in a healthy manner. And it really does make a whole world of difference in your existence. I should also like the term God in the phrase of the will of God to be understood, not so much in the Christian sense as in the sense intended by Diotima when she said, Eros, dear Socrates, is a mighty demon. The Greek words demon and daimonion express a determining power which comes upon man from the outside, like providence or fate. So the ethical decision is left to man. And that is exactly in accordance with what I think, right? The, the subconscious and the unconscious, or the stasis agent and the change agent. You are the ego as the choosing agent. All of it together is the self. And so that did the ethical decisions is the agent of change. Hey, do this thing, or the agent of stasis saying, hey, do this thing. And they are alternatively positive or negative, not necessarily good or evil, right? But change agent stays his agent, and there is a time for change and a time for staying the same. And so they're not necessarily good and evil in that particular sense, but they are positive and negative. They are change and stasis, masculine, feminine. And so they are the influences that you hear, in my estimation, as the conscious, both as a representative of the divine choice. You are here for the experience. You get to make the decisions as the soul, and you get to presented with choices. And sometimes those are external, but sometimes they are internal. And that is expressed through the subconscious and the unconscious, giving you the option. Hey, you can do this. Hey, you can do this. And you make the choice. So I'm in exact agreement with that. I mean, so far at least. He must know, however, what he is deciding about and what he is doing. Yes. Once you are able to discern that, yes. Like, actively, consciously take control of making the decision, not allowing your emotions to make the decision for you, realizing that the emotions are pointing out that there is a decision to be made. Then, if he obeys, he is following not just his own opinion, and if he rejects, he is destroying not just his own invention. The purely biological or scientific standpoint falls short in psychology because it is, in the main, intellectual only. That this should be so is not a disadvantage, since the methods of natural science have proved of great heuristic value in psychological research. But the psychic phenomenon cannot be grasped in its totality by the intellect, for it consists not only of meaning, but also of value. And this depends on the intensity and the intensity of the accompanying feeling tones. Hence, at least the two rational functions are needed in order to map out anything like a complete diagram of a given psychic content. Right now, the rational functions are going to be the ones in the first four slots, right? If you are familiar with my MBTI work, I'm not going to give the refresher. There are links for that. It's part of both the unconventional beliefs and the green stone, but there is a stack, right? And the first four slots are the parent or the hero, and then the responsibility slot. Then you have the child or the defensive slot, and then you have the inferior slot, which is uh, kind of ignored, right? It's useful. You use it, but very slightly. Within those first four slots is going to be the rational function. So whatever the top is, for me, I am an INFJ. That is an NIFETISE, right? So that is what I think is prime, or the one idea, the NI, and the TI, which is what I think are the two primary rational functions in my stack. If, therefore, in dealing with psychic contents, one makes allowance not only for intellectual judgments, but for value judgments as well, not only is the result a more complete picture of the contents in question, but one also gets a better idea of the particular position it holds in the hierarchy of psychic contents in general. The feeling value is a very important criterion, which psychology cannot do without, because it determines in large measure, the role which the content will play in the psychic economy. That is to say, the affective value gives the measure of the intensity of an idea, and the intensity in its turn expresses the idea's energetic tension, its effective potential. The shadow, for instance, usually has a decidedly negative feeling value, while the anima, like the animus, has more of a positive one, whereas the shadow is accompanied by more or less definite and describable feeling tones. The anima and animus exhibit feeling qualities that are harder to define. Mostly they are felt to be fascinating or numinous. Often they are surrounded by an atmosphere of sensitivity, touchy reserve, secretiveness, painful intimacy, and even absoluteness. The relative autonomy of the anima and animus figures expresses itself in these qualities. In order of affective rank, they stand in the shadow very much as the shadow stands in relation to ego consciousness. The main affective emphasis seems to lie in the latter. At any rate, it is able, by means of considerable expenditure of energy, to repress the shadow, at least temporarily. But if for any reason the unconscious gains the upper hand, then the valency of the shadow and of the other figures increases proportionally, so that the scale of values is reversed. What lay furthest away from the waking consciousness and seemed unconscious assumes, as it were, a threatening shape, and the affective value increases the higher up the scale you go. Ego consciousness, shadow, anima itself. This reversal of the conscious waking state occurs regularly during the transition from waking to sleeping, and what then emerge most vividly are the very things that were unconscious by day. Every abaissement de niveau mental brings about a relative reversal of values. I am speaking here of the subjective feeling value, which is subject to the more or less periodic changes as described above. But there are also objective values, which are founded on a consensus optimum. I lost my spot. Consensus optimum, moral, aesthetic, and religious values, for instance. And these are universally recognized ideals or feeling toned collective ideals. Levi Bruhl's representations collectives. The subjective feeling tones or value quanta are easily recognized by the kind and number of constellations or symptoms of disturbance they produce. Collective ideals often have no subjective feeling tone, but nevertheless retain their feeling value. This value, therefore, cannot be demonstrated by subjective symptoms, though it may be by the attributes attaching to these collective ideas and by their characteristic symbolism, quite apart from their suggestive effect. The problem has a practical aspect since it may easily happen that a collective idea, though significant in itself, is, because of its lack of subjective feeling tone, represented in a dream only by a subsidiary attribute, as when a god is represented by his stereomorphic attribute, etc. Conversely, the idea may appear in consciousness lacking the affective emphasis that properly belongs to it, and must then be transposed back into its archetypal context, a task that is usually discharged by poets and prophets. Thus, Halderlin, in his Hymn to Liberty, lets this concept, worn stale by frequent use and misuse, rise up again in its pristine splendor. Since her arm out of the dust has raised me, beats my heart so boldly and serene, and my cheek still tingles with her kisses, flushed and glowing where her lips have been. Every word she utters by her magic rises, new created, without flaw. Hearken to the tidings of my goddess, hearken to the sovereign, and adore. It is not difficult to see here that the idea of liberty has been changed back to its original dramatic state, into the shining figure of the anima, freed from the weight of the earth and the tyranny of the senses, the psychopomp who leads the way to the Elysian fields. Sorry. The first case we mentioned, where the collective idea is represented in a dream by a lowly aspect of itself, is certainly the more frequent. The goddess appears as a black cat, and the deity as the lapis exilis, stone of no worth. Interpretation then demands a knowledge of certain things which have less to do with zoology and mineralogy than with the existence of a historical consensus hominum in regard to the object in question, These mythological aspects are always present, even though in a given case they may be unconscious. For an instance, one doesn't happen to recall when considering whether to paint the garden gate green or white, that green is the color of life and hope. The symbolic aspect of green is nevertheless present as an unconscious suentendu. So we find something which has the highest significance for the life of the unconscious, standing lowest on the scale of conscious values, and vice versa. The figure of the shadow already belongs to the realm of bodiless phantoms, not to speak of anima and animus, which do not seem to appear at all except as projections upon our fellow human beings. As for the self, it is completely outside the personal sphere and appears, if at all, only as a religious mythologium, and its symbols range from the highest to the lowest. Anyone who identifies with the daylight half of his psychic life will therefore declare the dreams of the night to be null and void, notwithstanding that the night is as long as the day, and that all consciousness is manifestly founded on unconsciousness, is rooted in it, and every night is extinguished in it. What is more, psychopathology knows with tolerable certainty what the unconscious can do to the conscious, and for this reason, devotes to the unconscious an attention that often seems incomprehensible to the layman. We know, for instance, that what is small by day is big at night, and the other way around. Thus, we also know that besides the small by day, there also always looms the big by night, even when it is invisible. This knowledge is an essential prerequisite for any integration. That is to say, a content can only be integrated when its double aspect has become conscious, and when it is grasped not merely intellectually but understood according to its feeling value. Intellect and feeling, however, are difficult to put into one harness. They conflict with one another by definition. That is indeed the matrix of T and F, which is rigidity and feelings, well, flexibility, right? And so the thinking is rigidity, right? If you are relying strictly upon these structures, very much the authority says type of thing, right? This is the procedure which will get us there. Then you're more along the thinking lines. And if you are more, we can adjust this a little bit and take into consideration these things, right? You're more along the feeling side. And it is an axis for each other. So I am again in agreement. Whoever identifies with an intellectual standpoint will occasionally find his feeling confronting him like an enemy in the guise of an anima. Right? I'm very much FE. I'm concerned what other people feel and what I think. That is my matrix in that particular area. And so uh, I really have a tendency to suppress my feelings in favor of the responsibility of other people's feelings. Right? That is one of the things that I am working through. And so, as a thinker who is defensive over my thoughts, conflicting with how other people will feel, I can absolutely say that this is a true thing. You will find your feeling confronting you like an enemy in the guise of the anima. Conversely, an intellectual animus will make violent attacks on the feeling standpoint. Therefore, anyone who wants to achieve the difficult feat of realizing something not only intellectually, but according to its feeling value, must, for better or worse, come to grips with the anima animus problem in order to find a way for a higher union, a conjunctio oppositorum. This is indispensable prerequisite for wholeness, and that is why I have them 8 points. Although wholeness seems at first sight to be nothing but an abstract idea like anima and animus, it is nevertheless empirical insofar as it is anticipated by the psyche in the form of spontaneous or autonomous symbols. These are the quaternity or mandala symbols, which occur not only in the dreams of modern people who have never heard of them, but are widely disseminated in the historical records of many peoples and many epochs. Um, Besides the geometry portion of it, which is absolutely relevant to the symbology, right? There is a reason why the mandala is the symbology. It is beyond the geometry. In the psychedelic state, that's what you see. right? When you are in the altered state of the semi consciousness between the here and the spiritual, you see the actual mandala in the air around you. You can manipulate it if you do it right. Right? You can use that as a key system, as a matter of fact, but that's what you see. Right? That is the reason. That is the why. Whether it was from an artificial unlocking of the door through the consumption of a psychedelic, or if it was through the meditative practices and the appropriate flexation of the energetic centers, that is what it is. That's what they were recording, was the spiritual experience that is unfolded by that particular thing. And so, yes, it is symbology, right? But it has a very real spiritual, personal correlation that cannot be understated or overstated. I mean, it is so vitally important to understand why we have mandalas is because of that experience. Right. Their significance as symbols of unity and totality is amply confirmed by history as well as by empirical psychology. What at first looks like an abstract idea stands, in reality, for something that exists and can be experienced, that demonstrates it's an a priori presence spontaneously. I agree. Wholeness is thus an objective factor that confronts the subject independently of him, like anima or animus. And just as the latter have a higher position in the hierarchy than in the shadow, so wholeness lays claim to a position and a value superior to those of the syzygy. The syzygy seems to represent at least a substantial portion of it, if not actually two halves of the totality formed by the royal brother sister pair, and hence the tension of the opposites, from which the divine child is born as a symbol of unity. That I am in complete agreement with as well, right? You have the source, and then you have the binary, the choice of this and that, positive, negative. That is the syzygy, right? The royal brother sister pair. In fact, masculine, feminine. And so from that, you need mediation, right? To choose between this or that. You need something to do that. That is the divine child, which is you just as much as it was ever anyone else. And you, as the navigator of the temple of God, get to choose between the two agents in the way that you wish to go. It is literally the same thing. And so I'm in total agreement. Unity and totality stand at the highest point on the scale of objective values because their symbols can no longer be distinguished from the imago Dei. Hence, all statements about the God image also apply to the empirical symbols of totality. Right now, my understanding is that God created the creation, and therefore, while all of creation is God, right? He intentionally created all of the creation through his divine will, and so everything in creation is divine. All of creation is not the entirety of the divine. There is divine outside of the creation that we cannot understand, right? We can devote ourselves to trying to understand that. That is a positive aspiration. Generally, it manifests through service to others. And so it is a good thing to do, right? But don't ever get it in your mind that you have the only, because nobody in the creation can fully understand anything outside of the creation. Literally impossible. And so we will never fully understand exactly who God is. Right? There are many expressions of that, and many people believe that they have the only expression of that. Don't be so foolish as to be that person. Experience shows that individual mandalas are symbols of order and that they occur in patients principally during times of psychic disorientation or reorientation. As magic circles, they bind and subdue the lawless powers belonging to the world of darkness and depict or create an order that transforms the chaos into a cosmos. I am in agreement. The mandala at first comes into the conscious mind as an unimpressive point or dot, and a great deal of hard and painstaking work, as well as the integration of many projections, are generally required before the full range of the symbol can be anything like completely understood. If this insight were purely intellectual, it could be achieved without much difficulty, for the worldwide pronouncements about the God within us and above us, about Christ and the corpus mysticum, the personal and suprapersonal Atman, etc., are all formulations that can easily be mastered by the philosophical intellect. This is the common source of the illusion that one is then in possession of the thing itself, but actually one has acquired nothing more than its name, despite the age old prejudice that the name magically represents the thing, and that it is sufficient to pronounce the name in order to posit the thing's existence. In the course of the millennia, the reasoning mind has been given every opportunity to see through the futility of this conceit, though that has done nothing to prevent the intellectual mastery of a thing from being accepted at its face value. It is precisely our experiences in psychology which demonstrate as plainly as could be wished, that the intellectual grasp of a psychological fact produces no more than a concept of it, and that a concept is no more than a name, a flatus vocis. These intellectual encounters can be bandied about easily enough. They pass lightly from hand to hand, for they have no weight or substance. They sound full, but are hollow, and though purporting to designate a heavy task and obligation, they commit us to nothing. The intellect is undeniably useful in its own field, but it is a great cheat and illusionist outside of it whenever it tries to manipulate values. It would seem that one can pursue any science with the intellect alone except psychology, whose subject, the psyche, has more than the two aspects mediated by sense perception and thinking. The function of value, feeling, is an integral part of our conscious orientation and ought not be missing in a psychological judgment of any scope. Otherwise, the model we are trying to build of the real process will be incomplete. Every psychic process has a value quality attached to it, namely its feeling tone. This indicates the degree to which the subject is affected by the process or how much it means to him, insofar as the process reaches consciousness at all. It is as though the affect that the subject becomes involved, it is through the affect that the subject becomes involved and so comes to feel the whole weight of reality. The difference amounts roughly to that between a severe illness, which one reads about in a textbook, and the real illness which one has. In psychology, one possesses nothing unless one has experienced it in reality. Hence, a purely intellectual insight is not enough because one knows only the words and not the substance of the thing from inside. There are far more people who are afraid of the unconscious than one would expect. They are even afraid of their own shadow. And when it comes to the anima and animus, this fear turns to panic. For the syzygy does indeed represent the psychic contents that erupt into consciousness in a psychosis, most clearly of all in paranoid forms of schizophrenia. That is true. That's why I also tell you, right, there are the two voices. And if you hear one telling you, you need to kill these people, go seek help immediately. That is not the voice that you are needing to be listening to. Ever. Never. The overcoming of this fear is often a moral achievement of unusual magnitude. And yet, it is not the only condition that must be fulfilled on the way to a real experience of the self. The shadow, the syzygy, and the self are psychic factors of which an adequate picture can be formed only on the basis of a fairly thorough experience of them, just as these concepts arose out of an experience of reality. So they can be elucidated only by further experience. Philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in them unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts and that the concept is simply an abbreviated description or description of these facts. Such criticism has as little effect on the object as zoological criticism on a dumb-billed platypus. It is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. Unfortunately, I cannot pass on this experience to my public. I've tried in a number of publications, with the help of case material, to present the nature of these experiences and also the method of obtaining them. Wherever my methods were really applied, the facts I have been confirmed. One could see the moons of Jupiter even in Galileo's day if one took the trouble to use his telescope. Outside the narrower field of professional psychology, these figures meet with understanding from all who have any knowledge of comparative mythology. They have no difficulty in recognizing the shadows as at first representative of the dark chthonic world, a figure whose characteristics are universal. The syzygy is immediately comprehensible as a psychic prototype of all divine couples. Finally, the self, on account of its empirical peculiarities, proves to be the eidos behind the Supreme's ideas of unity and totality, and that are inherent in all monotheistic and monistic systems. I regard these parallels as important because it is possible, through them, to relate so called metaphysical concepts which have lost their root connection with natural experience in living, universal psychic processes so that they can recover their true and original meaning. In this way, the connection is reestablished between the ego and projected contents now formulated as metaphysical ideas. Unfortunately, as already said, the fact that metaphysical ideas exist and are believed in does nothing to prove the actual existence of their content or the object they refer to, although the coincidence of idea and reality in the form of a special psychic state, a state of grace, should not be deemed impossible, even if the subject cannot bring it about by an act of will. Once metaphysical ideas have lost their capacity to recall and evoke the original experience, they have not only become useless, but prove to be actual impediments on the road to wider development. One clings to possessions that have once meant wealth, and the more ineffective, incomprehensible, and lifeless they become, the more obstinately people cling to them. Naturally, it is only sterile ideas that they cling to. Living ideas have content and riches enough, so there is no need to cling to them. Thus, in the course of time, the meaningful turns into the meaningless. This is unfortunately the fate of metaphysical ideas. Today, it is a real problem what on earth such ideas can mean. The world, so far as it has not completely turned its back on tradition, has long ago stopped wanting to hear a message. It would rather be told what the message means. The words that resound from the pulpit are incomprehensible and cry for an explanation. How has the death of Christ brought us redemption when no one feels redeemed? And there's a lot there. In the way Jesus is a God man, and in what way is Jesus a God man, and what is such a being? What is the Trinity about? And the parthenogenesis, the eating of the body and the drinking of the blood and all the rest of it? What connection can there be between the world of such concepts and the everyday world, whose material reality is the concern of natural science on the widest possible scale? At least 16 hours out of 24, we live exclusively in this everyday world, and the remaining 8 we spend preferably in an unconscious condition. Where and when does anything take place to remind us, even remotely, of phenomena like angels, miraculous feedings, beatitudes, and resurrection of the dead, etc.? Is there therefore something of a discovery to find that during the unconscious state of sleep intervals occur called dreams, which occasionally contain scenes having not inconsiderable resemblance to the motifs of mythology? For myths are miracle tales and treats of all those things which, very often, are also objects of belief. In the everyday world of consciousness, such things hardly exist. That is to say, until 1933, only lunatics would have been found in possession of a living fragment of mythology. After this date, the world of heroes and monsters spread like a devastating fire over whole nations, proving that the strange world of myth had suffered no loss of vitality during the centuries of reason and enlightenment. No, it suffered deliberate suppression at the point of a sword. If metaphysical ideas have no longer have such a fascinating effect as before, this is certainly not due to any lack of primitivity in the European psyche, but simply and solely to the fact that the erstwhile symbols no longer express what is now welling up from the unconscious as the end result of the development of Christian consciousness through the centuries. This end result is a true antimimium, pneuma, a false spirit of arrogance, hysteria, woolly mindedness, criminal amorality, and doctrinaire fanaticism, a purveyor of shoddy spiritual goods, spurious art, philosophical stutterings, and utopian humbug, fit only to be fed wholesale to the mass of man today. That is what the post Christian spirit looks like. All right. Christ, the symbol of the self. The de-Christianization of our world, the Luciferian development of science and technology, and the frightful material and moral destruction left behind by the Second World War have been compared more than once with the eschatological events foretold in the New Testament. These, as we know, are concerned with the coming of the Antichrist. This is the Antichrist who denieth the Father and the Son. Every spirit that dissolveth Jesus is Antichrist, of whom you have heard that he cometh. The apocalypse is full of expectations of terrible things that will take place at the end of time, before the marriage of the Lamb. This shows plainly the anima Christiana as a sure knowledge not only of the existence of an adversary, but also of its future usurpation of power. Why, my reader will ask, do I discourse here upon Christ and his adversary, the Antichrist? Our discourse necessarily brings us to Christ because he is the still living myth of our culture. He is our culture hero who, regardless of his historical existence, embodies the myth of the divine primordial man, the mystic Adam. It is he who occupies the center of the Christian mandala, who is the Lord of the Tetramorph, an example, the four symbols of the evangelist, which are like the four columns of his throne. He is in us, and we in him. His kingdom is the pearl of great price, the treasure buried in the field, the grain of mustard seed, which will become a great tree, and the heavenly city. As Christ in us, so also is this heavenly kingdom. These few familiar references should be sufficient to make the psychological position of the Christ symbol quite clear. Christ exemplifies the archetype of the self. He represents a totality of divine or heavenly kind, a glorified man, a son of God, sans macula peccatae, unspotted by sin. As Adam's secondus, he corresponds to the first Adam before the fall, when the latter was still a pure image of God, of which Tertullian says, and this therefore is to be considered as the image of God in man, that the human spirit has the same motions and senses as God has, though not in the same way as God has them. That is an assumption. There is no reason to believe that that is true. Origen is very much more explicit. The imago Dei imprinted on the soul, not on the body, is an image of an image. For my soul is not directly the image of God, but is made after the likeness of the former image. That is a better assumption, but still an assumption. Christ, on the other hand, is the true image of God, after whose likeness our inner man is made, invisible, incorporeal, incorrupt, and immortal. The God image in us reveals through prudentia, aestitia, moderatio, virtus, sapientia, et disciplina. St. Augustine distinguishes between the God image, which is Christ, and the image which is implanted in man as a means or possibility of becoming like God. The God image is not in the corporeal man, but in the anima rationalis, the possession of which distinguishes man from animals. How do you know that animals are not an expression of God? I wonder who created them. The God image is within, not in the body, where the understanding is, where the mind is, where the power of investigating the truth is. There God has his image. Therefore, we should remind ourselves, says Augustine, that we are fashioned after the image of God, but nowhere save in the understanding. But where man knows himself to be made after the image of God, there he knows something more in him than is given to the beasts. From this, it is clear that the God image is, so to speak, identical with the anima rationalis. The latter is the higher spiritual man, the homo coelestius of St. Paul. Like Adam before the fall, Christ is an embodiment of the God image, whose totality is specially emphasized by St. Augustine. The Word, he says, took on complete manhood, as if it were its fullness, the soul and body of a man. And if you would have me put it more exactly, since even a beast of the field has a soul and a body, when I say a human soul and human flesh, I mean he took upon him a complete human soul. I agree, he was completely human. The God image in man, if he existed, he was completely human. Right? Then the divine did not manifest inside of itself in his fullness. That is an impossibility. The God image in man was not destroyed by the fall, but was only damaged and corrupted, deformed, and can be restored through God's grace. I'm not going to get started on the fall. I have a book, 43 Points of Contention. The scope of the integration is suggested by the descensus ad inferos, the descent of Christ's soul to hell, its work of redemption embracing even the dead. The psychological equivalent of this is the integration of the collective unconscious, which forms an essential part of the individuation process. St. Augustine says, therefore, our end must be our perfection, but our perfection is Christ, since he is the perfect God image. For this reason, he is also called King. His bride, Sponsa, is the human soul, which, in an inwardly hidden spiritual mystery, is joined to the Word, that two may be one in one flesh, to correspond with the mystic marriage of Christ and the Church. I believe that the Spirit is the animating force that makes things happen, right? You have the temple, which is the flesh, and that is the body and the earth. Then you have the deciding factor or the individual piece of God that he gave you to navigate the temple. That is the soul, and you make the decisions. But when you make those decisions, they are carried out by the Holy Spirit, right? Those electrical impulses, that is part of the Holy Spirit. That is potentiality being changed into actuality. That is the Holy Spirit in reality keeping you alive. Your heart beating, that's the Spirit. You breathing when you're asleep and not consciously aware of it, that is the same thing. Concurrently with the continuance of this hieros gamos in the dogma and rites of the church, the symbolism developed in the course of the Middle Ages into the alchemical conjunction of opposites, or chemical wedding, thus giving rise on the one hand to the concept of the lapis philosophorum, signifying totality, and on the other hand to the concept of chemical combination. My second book, The Green Stone, is dealing exclusively, pretty much, with the spiritual alchemy and how it can be applied into the real world. The creation of the lapis philosophorum, the alchemist stone, the sorcerer's stone, the philosopher's stone, right? The green hard lattice that is combining those 8 points that I talked about earlier into projection in balance. That is the creation of the philosopher's stone. And that's how you make the elixir. The God image in man that was damaged by the first sin can be reformed with the help of God in accordance with Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God. The totality images with the unconscious, produces in the course of an individuation process are similar reformations of an a priori archetype, the mandala. As I have already emphasized, these spontaneous symbols of the self or of the wholeness cannot in practice be distinguished from the God image. Despite the word be transformed in the Greek text of the above quotation, the renewal of the mind is not meant as an actual alteration of consciousness, but rather the restoration of an original condition, an apokatastasis. This is in exact agreement with the empirical findings of psychology that there is an ever present archetype of wholeness, which may easily disappear from the purview of consciousness or may never be perceived at all until a consciousness illuminated by conversion recognizes it in the figure of Christ in that particular religion. Right? That is something that is possible outside of that religion through a different figure. Other people have different visions. As a result of this anamnesis, the original state of oneness with the God image is restored. It brings about an integration, a bridging of the split in the personality caused by instincts striving apart in different and mutually contradictory directions. And the reason why I pointed that out, right, it is important to remember that there is, I'm about to step on some big toes. There is nothing that you do through the will of Jesus Christ that you cannot do by expressing the exact same thing through God or even through the self. Now, I don't recommend the self because that is a bad lens, in my opinion, to use, but the results are going to be exactly the same. Exactly the same. If you are faithful that it is God, right, and you do the appropriate things with the faithful intentions set towards that, that's what's going to happen. If you use the name of Jesus, that's what's going to happen. If you choose to worship a pen and you set the correct intentions and the correct methodology, you can make it happen. Right? Your intentionality and understanding is the part that is important. I believe in God. Right? I fully and firmly believe in a created universe. You don't necessarily have to in order to do the corrections. That is one of the problems with that zealotry we were talking about earlier. My way is the only way. Well, not really. I mean, there are a lot of different expressions, and people can truly find God through their expression. So many people do find God through the expression of Jesus Christ. That is a truth. But they also find God through the expression of Muhammad and Allah. That is a truth. They find it through Kali and the Hindu true beliefs. That is a truth. They find it through Zoroastrianism, and that is a truth. And you may not like that particular truth, but it does not change the facts as we began this particular chapter with. And so the only time the split does not occur is when a person is still as legitimately unconscious of his instinctual life as an animal. But it proves harmful and impossible to endure when an artificial unconsciousness, a repression, no longer reflects the life of the instincts. There can be no doubt that the original Christian conception of the imago Dei, embodied in Christ, meant an all embracing totality that even includes the animal side of man. Nevertheless, the Christ symbol lacks wholeness in the modern psychological sense, since it does not include the dark side of things, but specifically excludes it in the form of a Luciferian opponent. It is part of the binary. Although the exclusion of the power of evil was something the Christian consciousness was well aware of, all it lost in effect was an insubstantial shadow, for through the doctrine of priviato boni, first propounded by Origen, evil was characterized as a mere diminution of good and thus deprived of substance. According to the teachings of the church, evil is simply the accidental lack of perfection. This assumption resulted in the proposition omne bonum ad Deo, omne malum ab homini. Another logical consequence was the subsequent elimination of the devil in certain Protestant sects. You don't need any of the entities. Thanks to the doctrine of the priviato boni, wholeness seemed guaranteed in the figure of the Christ. One must, however, take evil rather more substantially when one meets it on the plane of empirical psychology. Hmm. It is one of the things that I strive to remember when discussing things is that many people have never met actual evil, right? They've met bad people, they met bad intentions, but they never really met evil, right? The people that really choose that lifestyle. And so it's important to remember that if you have met true evil, that you've had a different experience than most people. There it is simply the opposite of good. In the ancient world, the Gnostics, whose arguments were very much influenced by psychic experience, tackled the problem of evil on a broader basis than the church fathers. For instance, one of the things they taught was that Christ cast off his shadow from himself. If we give this view the weight it deserves, we can easily recognize the cut off counterpart in the figure of an Antichrist. The Antichrist develops in legend as a perverse imitator of Christ's life. He is a true Greek, an imitating spirit of evil who follows in Christ's footsteps like a shadow following the body. This complementing of the bright but one sided figure of the Redeemer, we even find traces of it in the New Testament, must be of special significance, and indeed considerable attention was paid to it quite early. If we see the traditional figure of Christ as a parallel to the psychic manifestation of the self, then the Antichrist would correspond to the shadow of the self, namely the dark half of the human totality, which ought not to be judged too optimistically. So far as we can judge from experience, light and shadow are so evenly distributed in man's nature that his psychic totality appears, to say the least of it, in a somewhat murky light. The psychological concept of the self, in part derived from our knowledge of the whole man, but for the rest, depicting itself spontaneously in the products of the unconscious as an archetypal quaternity bound together by inner antinomies, cannot omit the shadow that belongs to the light figure, for without it, this figure lacks body and humanity. In the empirical self, light and shadow form a paradoxical unity. In the Christian concept, on the other hand, the archetype is hopelessly split into two irreconcilable halves, leading ultimately to a metaphysical dualism, the final separation of the kingdom of heaven from the fiery world of the damned. For anyone who has a positive attitude towards Christianity, the problem of the Antichrist is a hard nut to crack. It is nothing less than the counterstroke of the devil, provoked by God's incarnation. For the devil attains its true stature as the adversary of Christ, and hence of God, only after the rise of Christianity, while as late as the book of Job, he was still one of God's sons and on familiar terms with Yahweh. Psychologically, the case is clear, since the dogmatic figure of Christ is so sublime and spotless that everything else turns dark beside it. It is, in fact, so one sidedly perfect that it demands a psychic complement to restore the balance. This inevitable opposition led very early to the doctrine of the two sons of God, of whom the elder was called Sataniel. The coming of the Antichrist is not just a prophetic prediction, it is an inexorable psychological law whose existence, though unknown to the author of the Johannine epistles, brought him a sure knowledge of the impending enantiodromia. Consequently, he wrote as if he were conscious of the inner necessity for this transformation, though we may be sure that the idea seemed to him like a divine revelation. In reality, every intensified differentiation of the Christ image brings about a corresponding accentuation of its unconscious complement, thereby increasing the tension between above and below. In making these statements, we are keeping entirely within the sphere of Christian psychology and symbolism. A factor that no one is reckoned with, however, is the fatality inherent in the Christian disposition itself, which leads inevitably to a reversal of its spirit, not through the obscure workings of chance, but in accordance with psychological law. The ideal of spirituality, striving for the heights, was doomed to clash with the materialistic earthbound passion to conquer matter and master of the world. This change became visible at the time of the Renaissance. The word means rebirth, and it referred to the renewal of the antique spirit. We know today that this spirit was chiefly a mask. It was not the spirit of antiquity that was reborn, but the spirit of medieval Christianity that underwent strange pagan transformations, exchanging the heavenly goal for an earthly one, and the vertical of the Gothic style for a horizontal perspective. Voyages of discovery, exploration of the world and of nature. These subsequent developments that led to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution have produced a worldwide situation today, which can only be called anti Christian in a sense that it confirms the early Christian anticipation of the end of time. It is as if, with the coming of Christ, opposites that were latent till then had become manifest, or as if a pendulum had swung violently to one side and were now carrying out the complementary movement to the opposite direction. There you go. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The double meaning of this movement lies in the nature of the pendulum. Christ is without spot, but right at the beginning of his career, there occurs an encounter with Satan, the adversary, who represents the counterpole of that tremendous tension in the world psyche which Christ's advent signified. He is the mysterium iniquitatis that accompanies the soul Eustiae as inseparably as the shadow belongs to the light in exactly the same way. So the Ebionites, the Eucharites, thought that one brother cleaves to another. Both strive for a kingdom, one for the kingdom of heaven, the other for the Principatus Huius Mundi. We hear of a reign of 1,000 years and of a coming of the Antichrist, just as if a apparition of worlds and epochs had taken place between two royal brothers. The meeting with Satan was therefore more than mere chance. It was a link in the chain. Just as we have to remember the gods of antiquity in order to appreciate the psychological value of the animus archetype, so Christ is our nearest analogy of the self and its meaning. It is naturally not a question of a collective value artificially manufactured or arbitrarily awarded, but of one that is effective and present per se, and that makes its effectiveness felt, whether the subject is conscious of it or not. Yet, although the attributes of Christ, co-substantiality with the Father, co-eternity, filiation, parthenogenesis, crucifixion, lamb sacrifice between opposites, one divided into many, etc., undoubtedly mark him out as an embodiment of the self. Looked at from the psychological angle, he corresponds to only one half of the archetype. The other half appears in the Antichrist. The latter is just as much a manifestation of the self, except that he consists of its dark aspect. Both are Christian symbols, and they have the same meaning as the image of the Savior crucified between two thieves. This great symbol tells us that the progressive development and differentiation of consciousness leads to an ever more menacing awareness of the conflict and involves nothing less than a crucifixion of the ego. Its agonizing suspension between irreconcilable opposites. Naturally, there can be no question of a total extinction of the ego, for then the focus of consciousness would be destroyed, and the result would be complete unconsciousness. The relative abolition of the ego affects only those supreme and ultimate decisions which confront us in situations where there are insoluble conflicts of duty. This means, in other words, that in such cases, the ego is a suffering bystander who decides nothing, but must submit to a decision and surrender unconditionally. The genius of man, the higher and more spacious part of him, whose extent no one knows, has the final word. It is therefore well to examine carefully the psychological aspects of the individuation process in the light of Christian tradition, which can describe it for us with an exactness and impressiveness far surpassing our feeble attempts, even though the Christian image of the self, Christ, lacks the shadow that properly belongs to it. Man, oh man. The reason for this, as already indicated, is the doctrine of the summum bonum. Irenaeus says very rightly, in refuting the Gnostics, that exception must be taken to the light of their Father, because it could not illuminate or fill even those things which were within it, namely the shadow and the void. It seemed to him scandalous and reprehensible to suppose that within the pleroma of light there could be a dark and formless void. For the Christian, neither God nor Christ could be a paradox. They had to have a single meaning, and this holds true to the present day. No one knew, and apparently, with a few commendable exceptions, no one knows even now that the hybris of the speculative intellect had already emboldened the ancients to propound a philosophical definition of God that more or less obliged him to be the summum bonum. A Protestant theologian has even had the temerity to assert that God can only be good. Yahweh. That is why I say, like, I use the phrase God is good all of the time. Every time anything good happens, anytime anything bad happens, I say the phrase God is good. But he is ambivalent at best. He will enable you to go along your way, the wrong way, just as well as the right way. It is up to you to decide. That is why crime does indeed pay quite often. Not in the long run, but in the short run, for sure. Yahweh could certainly have taught him a thing or two in this respect. If he himself is unable to see his intellectual trespass against God's freedom and omnipotence. The forcible usurpation of the sonum bonum naturally has its reasons, the origins of which lie far back in the past, though I cannot enter into this here. Nevertheless, it is the effective source of the concept of the priviato boni, which nullifies the reality of evil, and can be found as early as Basil the Great and Dionysius the Areopagite, second half of the 4th century, and is fully developed in Augustine. The earliest authority for all of the latter axiom, omni bonum ad Deo, omni malum ab homine, is Tatian, 2nd century, who says, nothing evil was created by God. We ourselves have produced all wickedness. This view is adopted by Theophilus of Antioch, 2nd century, in his treatise Ad Autolicum. Basil says, you must not look upon God as the author of the existence of evil, nor consider that evil has any subsistence in itself, for evil does not subsist as a living being does, nor can we set before our eyes any substantial essence thereof. For evil is the privation of good, and thus evil does not inhere in its own substance, but arises from the mutilation of the soul. Neither is it uncreated, as the wicked say, who set up evil for the equal of good, nor is it created. For if all things are of God, how can evil arise from good? I mean, evil is an opportunity. Evil does exist. There is objective evil. There is absolutely objective evil. Right? Choosing to murder and mutilate people is objective evil. I don't care if you don't believe that, you have a problem, right? If you don't believe that the murder and mutilation of another human being is an absolute evil, you have a problem. And so it does exist, right? And there are people who willfully choose those things, knowing full well that they are making that choice. That makes them evil, right? And so, evil, if God doesn't create anything good and all of creation is good and nothing bad can ever happen, even the people choosing evil, right? That is true. That is an experience, but it is not the best one, right? It is the worst one. You are choosing the exact opposite of what would be good in your own life. And so you are, again, in a different way, choosing evil. And so that's how it can arise through the willful choice of mankind, sure, but the choice was there from God in existence through creation. One of them really hard things to wrap your whole mind around. I give you that. Another passage sheds light on the logic of this statement. In the second homily of the Hexamerion, Basil says, it is equally impious to say that evil has its origin from God, because the contrary cannot proceed from the contrary. Life does not engender death. Darkness is not the origin of light. Sickness is not the maker of health. Now, if evil is neither uncreated nor created by God, whence comes its nature? That evil exists, no one living in the world would deny. What then? What shall we say then? That evil is not a living and animated entity, but a condition of the soul, opposed to virtue, proceeding from like minded persons on account of their falling away from good? Each of us should acknowledge that he is the first author of the wickedness in him. I can agree with that. The perfectly natural fact that when you say high, you immediately postulate low is here twisted in a causal relationship and reduced to absurdity, since it is sufficiently obvious that darkness produces no light and light produces no darkness. Exactly, right? That's the part, right? I was getting towards the sin, I can agree with, right? You do choose the evil, right? The option is there through the divine, right? There is nothing in existence that is not there at the will of the divine. And so you do have the option to choose the wrong things. The idea of good and they are still wrong, right? It doesn't make it right because you chose it. The idea of good and evil, however, is the premise for any moral judgment. They are logically equivalent pair of opposites, and as such, the sine qua non of all acts of cognition. From the empirical standpoint, we cannot say more than this, and from the standpoint, we would have to assert that good and evil, being coexistent halves of moral judgment, do not derive from one another, but are always there together. Evil, like good, belongs to the category of human values, and we are the authors of moral value judgments, but only to a limited degree, or we're the authors of the facts submitted to our moral judgment. These facts are called by one person good and by another evil. Only in capital cases is there anything like a consensus generalis. And that is true, right? That is where the moral relativism really makes things muddy, right? If you can keep the primes in mind, the H points, the checks, and make sure that you are in balance for those 8 checkpoints, it is a lot easier to make sure that you are not choosing the wrong things. If we hold with Basil that man is the author of evil, we are saying the same breath that he is also the author of good. But man is first and foremost the author merely of judgments in relation to the facts judged. His responsibility is not so easy to determine. In order to do this, we would have to give a clear definition to the extent of his free will. The psychiatrist knows what a desperately difficult task this is. Right? The problem is that you're not an asshole until you see the trash thing, right? You can walk by trash and not see it, and you're not an asshole, right? But once you see that there is trash on the ground and you just casually walk past it, you are an asshole. Right? And so you are responsible for the level that you have attained. And so if you know that the choice is going to be evil straight off the top and you choose it, then that is choosing the evil. Right? You are the asshole. But the point is, right, up until you see it, you don't really have the free will to not choose to pick it up. You're just walking past it. You don't even really see it. Once you see it, the free will comes into play. It is no longer just an option that is there, it is a choice that you are actively making. For these reasons, the psychologist shrinks from metaphysical assertions but must criticize the admittedly human foundations of the priviato boni. When, therefore, Basil asserts, on the one hand, that evil has no substance of its own and but arises from a mutilation of the soul, and if, on the other hand, he is convinced that evil really exists, then the relative reality of evil is grounded on a real mutilation of the soul, which must have an equally real cause. If the soul was originally created good, then it has really been corrupted and by something that is real, even if this is nothing more than carelessness, indifference, and frivolity, which are the meanings of this Greek word. When something, I must stress this with all possible emphasis, is traced back to a psychic condition or fact, it is very definitely not reduced to nothing and thereby nullified, but is shifted onto the plane of psychic reality, which is very much easier to establish empirically than, say, the reality of the devil and dogma. who, according to the authentic sources, was not invented by man at all, but existed long before he did. Hmm. According to the authentic sources. Right? The devil, hell, and uh, heaven as concepts came from Zoroastrianism. Very interesting. If the devil fell away from God of his own free will, this proves firstly that evil was in the world before man, and therefore the man cannot be the sole author of it. And secondly, that the devil already had a mutilated soul for which we must hold a real cause responsible. The basic flaw in Bassel's argument is the petitio principii that lands him in insoluble contradictions. It is laid down from the start, and the independent existence of evil must be denied, even in the face of the eternity of the devil as asserted by dogma. The historical reason for this was the threat presented by Manichaean dualism. This is especially clear in the treatise of Titus of Bostra, entitled Adversus Manichaeos, where he states in refutation that the Manichaeans that, so far as substance is concerned, there is no such thing as evil. John Chrysostom uses, instead of privatio, the expression deviation or turning away from good. He says, evil is nothing other than turning away from good, and therefore evil is secondary in relation to good. Dionysius the Areopagite gives a detailed explanation of evil in the 4th chapter of Divinis Nominibus. Evil, he says, cannot come from good, because if it came from good, it would not be evil. But since everything that exists came from good, everything is in some way good, and evil does not exist at all. Evil in its nature is neither a thing, nor does it bring anything forth. Evil does not exist at all, and is neither good nor productive of good. All things which are, by the very fact that they are good, and come from good. But insofar as they are deprived of good, they are neither good nor do they exist. That which has no existence is not altogether evil, for the absolutely non existent would be nothing, unless it be thought of as subsisting in the good superessentially. Good, then, is absolutely existing, and as absolutely non existing, will stand in the foremost and highest place, while evil is neither in that which exists nor in that which does not exist. These quotations show with what emphasis the reality of evil was denied by the Church Fathers. As already mentioned, this hangs together with the Church's attitude to Manichaean dualism, as can plainly be seen in St. Augustine. In his polemic against the Manichaeans and Marcionites, he makes the following declaration. For this reason, all things are good, since some things are better than others, and the goodness of the less good adds to the glory of the better. These things we call evil, then, are defects in good things, and quite incapable of existing in their own right outside of good things. But those very defects testify to the natural goodness of things. For what is evil by reason of a defect must obviously be good of its own nature, for a defect is something contrary to nature, something which damages the nature of a thing, and it can do so only by diminishing that thing's goodness. Evil, therefore, is nothing but a privation of the good, and thus it can have no existence anywhere except in some good thing. So there can be things which are good without any evil in them, such as God himself and the higher celestial beings, but there can be no evil things without good, for if evils cause no damage to anything, they are not evils. If they do damage something, they diminish its goodness, and if they damage it still more, it is because it is still has some goodness which they diminish, and if they swallow it up altogether, nothing of its nature is left to be damaged. And so there will be no evil by which it can be damaged, since there is then no nature left whose goodness can damage any damage can diminish. The lengths that we will go to justify what we want. The Liber Sinitarium Exhaustino says, evil is not substance, for it has not God for its author. This is entirely in Latin. I can't do that. For its author, it's does not exist, and so the defect of corruption is nothing else than the desire or act of misdirected will. Augustine agrees with this when he says, "The steel is not evil, but the man who uses the steel for criminal purpose is evil." Right? Tools have no intrinsic good or bad nature. These quotations clearly exemplify the standpoint of Dionysius and Augustine. Evil has no substance or existence in itself, since it is merely a diminution of good, which alone has substance. Evil is vitium, a bad use of things, and as a result of erroneous decisions of the will, blindness due to evil desire, etc. Thomas Aquinas, the great theoretician of the church, says with reference to the above quotation from Dionysius, "One opposite is known through the other, as darkness is known through light. Hence is what evil is must be known from the nature of good. Now we have said above that good is everything appetible, and thus, since every nature desires its own being and its own perfection, it must necessarily be said that the being and perfection of every created thing is essentially good. Hence, it cannot be that evil signifies a being or any form of nature. Therefore, it must be that by the name of evil is signified the absence of good. Evil is not a being, whereas good is a being. That every agent works for an end clearly follows from the fact that every agent tends to something definite. Now, that to which the agent tends definitely must needs be befitting to that agent, since the latter would not tend to it save on account of some fittingness thereto. But that which is befitting to a thing is good for it. Therefore, every agent works for a good. St. Thomas himself recalls the saying of Aristotle that the thing is the whiter, the less it is mixed with black, without mentioning, however, that the reverse proposition, the thing is the blacker, the less it is mixed with the white, not only has the same validity as the first, but is also its logical equivalent. He might also have mentioned that not only darkness is known through light, but that conversely, light is known through darkness. As only that which works is real, so according to St. Thomas, only good is real in the sense of existing. His argument, however, introduces a good that is tantamount to convenient, sufficient, appropriate, suitable. One ought therefore to translate omni agens agit propter bonum as every agent works for the sake of what suits it. That's what the devil does too, as we all know. He too has an appetite and strives after perfection, not in good, but in evil. Even so, one could hardly conclude from this that his striving is essentially good. Obviously, evil can be represented as a diminution of good, but with this kind of logic, one could just as well say the temperature of the Arctic winter, which freezes our noses and ears, is relatively speaking only a little below the heat prevailing at the equator, for the Arctic temperature seldom falls much lower than 230 degrees Celsius above absolute zero. All things on Earth are warm in the sense that nowhere is absolute zero even approximately reached. Similarly, all things are more or less good, as just as cold is nothing but a diminution of warmth. So evil is nothing but a diminution of good. The priviato boni argument remains a euphemistic petitio principii, no matter whether evil is regarded as a lesser good or as an effect of the finiteness and limitedness of created things. I disagree. I do, because the act of intentional murder is evil, right? With no provocation, no self defense, right? The act of choosing to kill someone else is an evil act. And so, therefore, evil does exist in its primal form, right? And so, I disagree on that logical, like, that is my logical foundation for that, right? There is absolute evil. I know I have witnessed absolute evil, right? I was real close to absolute evil. And so, I do know that it is a thing. Most of the things that we ascribe to being evil, however, are really just more relativism, right? You don't know whether smoking is evil or not. You don't know whether drinking is evil or not. The overconsumption of anything is objectively evil, right? The taking beyond the need and using without the use of the need for is evil, right? That is leaning into the evil at least. Taking like the overconsumption of things through greed or gluttony is literally just trying to deny something else the opportunity to have that. And so that is operating in opposition to the betterment of yourself and creation. And so for me, that is definitionally evil. And so I don't agree with that just for that, right? There are absolutely gray areas of moral relativism that way too many people get tied down in, but there is objectively the self sacrifice for yourself, for others, is an expression of good every single time, even up into including your own personal death, right? Saving the life of a child or someone in need is absolutely an act of good. There has to be an opposite. The taking of a life through deliberate choice is an act of absolute evil. And again, that is not, you can't ever kill somebody in self-defense. I am not that person at all. But you don't have the right to aggress upon anyone. And if you take that to the extremity, then to me, that isn't an expression of absolute evil. The false conclusion necessary follows the premise dues summum bonum, since it is unthinkable that the perfect good could ever have created evil. It has merely created the good and the less good, which last is simply called worse by laymen. Just as we freeze miserably despite a temperature of 230 above absolute zero, so there are people and things that, although created by God, are good only to the minimal and bad to the maximal degree. It is probably from this tendency to deny any reality to evil that we get the axiom, "Ana bonum deo, ana malum ab hominem." This is a contradiction of the truth that he who created the heat is also responsible for the cold, the goodness of the less good. We can certainly hand it to the Augustine that all natures are good, yet just not good enough to prevent their badness from being equally obvious. One could hardly call the things that have happened and still happen in the concentration camps of the dictator states an accidental lack of perfection. It would sound like mockery. I absolutely agree. Like, there was a degree of that, though, right? Like, I'm just doing my job, and many people, like, even in the camps, there were people that did not know that there were deaths. Now, you have to be remarkably obtuse to not see that, but there was that happening. A lot of people were making the judgment just to stay alive, and that's not objectively evil, right? The people who were deciding to load up the rooms and drop the gas, that was objectively evil. And that's where that moral gray ground comes in, right? If you're inadvertently participating in the mass genocide of people, like that's some very gray ground, right? You not intentionally choosing it, but you're still very much involved in it. That's where the gray ground is. Psychology does not know what good and evil are in themselves. It only knows them as judgments about relationships. Good is what seems suitable, acceptable, or valuable from a certain point of view. Evil is its opposite. If the things that we call good are really good, then there must be evil things that are real too. It is evident that psychology is concerned with a more or less subjective judgment. An example with psychic antithesis that cannot be avoided in naming value relationships. Good denotes something that is not bad, and bad, something that is not good. There are things from which a certain point of view are extremely evil, that is to say, dangerous. There are also things in human nature which are very dangerous and which therefore seem proportionally evil to anyone standing in their line of fire. It is pointless to gloss over these evil things because that only lulls one into a sense of false security. Still contending with the idea of objective reality. That's one I can understand that, and especially since we can create our own reality in very large part. I mean, whether it is a simulation or not, And that is a possibility, right? Whether it is or not, whether this is an objective reality or not, we are still in it. And we are still here to do things and achieve things, up to and including our wildest dreams, not necessarily our wildest fantasies, but our wildest aspirations. And so all of that is well within the realm of possibility. We can do it. We limit ourselves in a wide variety of ways, but we are here in the reality, whether it is objective or not, right? Even if it all winds up to be a simulation and we go away to nothing, it's better to live your life as though there is something. There is something to that axiom. Human nature is capable of an infinite amount of evil, and evil deeds are real only as the good ones, so far as human experience goes, and so far as the psyche judges and differentiates between them. And again, that is taking out the, like, I do believe that he is not considering that, right? If you are saying that it is, right, then and he is saying also that there are evil things. This is the rationalization, I guess, but like there is absolute evil. There is like intentionally choosing the destruction for no purpose is evil. And then that may be my rationalization. I can accept that. Only unconsciousness makes no difference between good and evil. Inside the psychological realm, one honestly does not know which of them predominates in the world. We hope merely that good does, an example, what seems suitable to us. No one could possibly say what the general good might be. No amount of insight into the relativity and fallibility of our moral judgment can deliver us from these defects. And those who deem themselves beyond good and evil are usually the worst tormentors of mankind because they are twisted with the pain and fear of their own sickness. Today, as never before, it is important that human beings should not overlook the danger of the evil lurking within them. It is unfortunately only too real, which is why psychology must insist on the reality of evil and must reject any definition that regards it as insignificant or actually non existent. Okay, I am in agreement with that. Then is evil a facet of God's design? Does free will fall within God's design and does free will actually exist? Yes, you are free to choose evil, but that doesn't make it less evil. And by making that choice, you are not necessarily limited only to evil. You are presented with another choice immediately after that of good and evil again, and good and evil again. Right? You are always presented with the temptation to do the wrong thing and the temptation to do the right thing, and you get to freely choose between them. And so, yes, right, it is a facet of God's design. It is the choice between the polarity of positive and negative, masculine and feminine, stasis and change. It is you actively choosing between those two things, mediating. And so it does fall within God's design and it does actually exist. But if he knows of your evil and does not interfere to prevent said act of evil, does that make God evil? No. Being evil would be denying you the ability to make the choice to do the wrong thing. Right? Limiting you to not being able to make the choice is slavery. That is intellectual bound, right? That is not free will. That is the absolute antithesis of free will. If he is denying you the opportunity to experience the wrong thing, he's not giving you free will. He's setting you a predestiny, and he doesn't do that. You get to choose your destiny. You are the deciding agent in your life. And if you aren't making it, well, drop the ego that's so reluctant to defend yourself from your own actions. Right? Now that's the problem is the value of your self-importance as the label of ego, because I view ego as the deciding agent, right? And as the deciding agent, you are either consciously making a choice or unconsciously in every decision that you make, whether it is to go to work or not, what you're going to eat, put clothes you're putting on. You are either consciously making the choice or unconsciously making the choice. And so if you are taking conscious control of that, that is pushing the ego into service. Whereas if you are not and you are just unconsciously making the choice, that is becoming a slave to the ego. And so there is absolutely a balance to be stricken there. But I view the ego simply as the deciding agent, not necessarily as intrinsically something to be striven against. Then how can God know of your path before you choose it? Because he's still got all the paths, right? In my understanding, right? Just because I make this choice, right? The choice to talk to you in another, there was in another timeline, there was a me that did made the choice not to go live today, right? And that path still exists. It is still out there. And because I didn't go live today, we didn't have a discussion and something was different in your life, right? But that still exists out there. That is the choice for a timeline that I didn't choose. But in somebody else's life, that was a necessary action. It still had to happen. And so it plays out because on this one, I decided this. This is the path that I am on, and these are the branches that I have. But if I would have chosen this, these are the branches that I would have had. But all of those branches still exist because God is infinite and able to play out all of the expanses at the same time. It's just this particular incarnation that chose this particular timeline because I believe that this particular timeline is the one that is best aligned for my best. Okay, so are there separate realities for each of the outcomes associated with each of the potentialities? Hopefully that was clear. That is exactly what I believe. Not for you to know, carnal. Certainly is tempting to call it of the left brain hemisphere ego, right? And like, ah, we won't know, right? That is my speculation. And I always try to maintain it that way. I don't try to make it a doctrine or a dogma. And I am adjustable in it, but it does seem to be the most logical outplay of the situation as described by pretty much every culture. Now, there's a whole lot of when I say every culture, I'm talking about the primals, not necessarily the current iterations of things, right? And so that is absolutely not the case in Christianity, right? It's the one path, and there can't be any deviation, or you're punished forever. The whole free will thing, but uh, that is not something that we will ever know. And hopefully, I will never make the statement firmly that this is the only way that it possibly can be, because that is much like God's face. We can't know what that looks like. It might look like us. It might look like an elephant or a dolphin. It might look like some creature we don't even have on this planet. We don't know. We will never know. And it is a prideful assumption to place upon something that we don't know, the assumption that we do. So, and saying that we are created in God's image is a prideful statement. That is assuming that out of every potentiality in all of existence, you are the expression of God, right? The perfect valuation of it, right? The human form is the ultimate, right? That's a fairly prideful situation for something that you've never seen in actuality. Right. Psychology is an empirical science and deals with realities. As a psychologist, therefore, I have neither the inclination nor the competence to mix myself up with metaphysics. Only, I have to get polemical when metaphysics encroaches on experience or interprets it in a way that is not justified empirically. My criticism of the Privio Boni holds only so far as psychological experience goes. From a scientific point of view, the Privio Boni, as must be apparent to everyone, was founded on a petitio principii, where what invariably comes out at the end is what you put in at the beginning. Arguments of this kind have no power of conviction. But the fact that such arguments are not only used but are undoubtedly believed is something that cannot be disposed of so easily. It proves that there is a tendency, existing right from the start, to give priority to good and to do so with all of the means in our power, whether suitable or unsuitable. So, if Christian metaphysics clings to the Priviato Boni, it is giving expression to the tendency always to increase the good and diminish the bad. The Priviato Boni may therefore be a metaphysical truth. I presume to no judgment on this matter. I must only insist that our field of experience, white and black, light and dark, good and bad, are equivalent opposites which always predicate one another. This elementary fact was correctly appreciated in the so called Clementine Homilies, a collection of Gnostic Christian writings dating from about AD 150. The unknown author understands good and evil as the right and left hand of God and views the whole of creation in terms of syzygies, or pairs of opposites, in much the same way as the follower of Barsidanes, Marinius, sees good as light and pertaining to the right hand, and evil as dark and pertaining to the left. The left also corresponds to the feminine. Thus, in Arrhenius, Sophia Pronuncios is called Sinistra. Clement finds this altogether compatible with the idea of God's unity, provided that one has an anthropomorphic God image, and every God image is anthropomorphic in a more or less subtle way. The logic and naturalness of Clement's view can hardly be contested. At all events, this view, which may be to some 200 years older than the quotations given above, proves that the reality of evil does not necessarily lead to Manichaean dualism and so does not endanger the unity of the God image. As a matter of fact, it guarantees that unity on a plane beyond the crucial difference between the Yahwistic and the Christian points of view. Yahweh is notoriously unjust, and injustice is not good. The God of Christianity, on the other hand, is only good. There is no denying that Clement's theology helps us to get over this contradiction in a way that fits the psychological facts. It is therefore worth following up Clement's line of thought a little more closely. God, he says, appointed 2 kingdoms and 2 ages, determining that the present world should be given over to evil, because it is small and passes away quickly. But he promised to preserve the future world for good, because it is great and eternal. Clement goes on to say that this division into 2 corresponds to the structure of man. The body comes from the female, who is characterized by emotionality, the spirit from the male, who stands for rationality. He calls body and spirit the 2 triads. Man is compound of 2 mixtures, literally pastes, the male and the female. Wherefore the 2 always have been laid before him, those of obedience and of disobedience to law. And 2 kingdoms have been established, the one called the kingdom of heaven, and the other the kingdom of those who are now rulers upon earth. Of these 2, the one does violence to the other. Really? Moreover, these 2 rulers are the swift hands of God. That is a reference to Deuteronomy 32:9. I will kill and I will make to live. He kills with the left hand and saves with the right. These 2 principles have not their substance outside of God, for there is no other primal source, nor have they been sent forth from God as animals, for they were of the same mind with him. But from God were sent forth the first 4 elements, hot and cold, moist and dry. In consequence of this, he is the father of every substance, but not of the knowledge which arises from the mixing of the elements. For when these were combined from without, choice was begotten in them as a child. That is to say, through the mixing of the 4 elements, inequalities arose which caused uncertainty and so necessitated decisions or acts of choice. And like we have the 4 elements, right? The 4 directions, north, south, east, west, the 4 elements, air, fire, water, earth. But in addition to that, we got the 4 creative forces of existence, right? The strong and weak attractive forces, gravitation and electromagnetism that correspond fairly directly to that. The 4 elements form the fourfold substance of the body and also of evil. This substance was carefully discriminated and sent forth from God, but when it was combined from without, according to the will of him who sent it forth, there arose as a result of the combination the preference which rejoices in evils. The last sentence is to be understood as follows. The fourfold substance is eternal in God's child, but the tendency to evil was added from outside to the mixture willed by God. Thus, evil is not created by God or by anyone else, nor was it projected out of him, nor did it arise of itself. Peter, who was engaged in these reflections, is evidently not quite sure how the matter stands. It seems as if, without God's intending it, and possibly without his knowing it, the mixture of the four elements took a wrong turning. Though this is rather hard to square with Clement's idea of the opposite hands of God doing violence to one another. Obviously, Peter, the leader of the dialogue, finds it rather difficult to attribute the cause of evil to the Creator in so many words. The author of the homilies espouses a Petrine Christianity distinctly high church or ritualistic in flavor. This, taken together with the doctrine of the dual aspect of God, brings him into close relationship with the early Jewish Christian church, where, according to the testimony of Epiphanius, we find the Ebionite notion that God had two sons, an elder one, Satan, and a younger one, Christ. Machias, one of the speakers in the dialogue, suggests as much when he remarks that if good and evil were begotten in the same way, they must be brothers. In the Jewish Christian apocalypse, the ascension of Isaiah, we find in the middle section Isaiah's vision of the seven heavens through which he was wrapped. First, he saw Samael and his host, against whom a great battle was raging in the firmament. The angel then wafted him beyond this into the first heaven and led him before a throne. On the right of the throne stood angels who were more beautiful than the angels on the left. Those on the right all sang praises with one voice, but the ones on the left sang after them, and their singing was not like the singing of the first. In the second heaven, all of the angels were more beautiful than in the first heaven, and there was no difference between them, either here or in any of the higher heavens. Evidently, Samael still has a noticeable influence on the first heaven, since the angels on the left are not so beautiful there. Also, the lower heavens are not so splendid as the upper ones, though each surpasses the other in splendor. The devil, like the Gnostic archons, dwells in the firmament, and he and his angels, presumably, correspond to astrological gods and influences. The gradation of splendor, going all the way up to the topmost heaven, shows that a sphere interpenetrates with the divine sphere of the Trinity, whose light, in turn, filters down as far as the lowest heaven. This paints a picture of complementary opposites balancing one another like right and left hands. Significantly enough, this vision, like the Clementine homilies, belongs to the pre-Manichaean period, 2nd century, when there was, as yet, no need for Christianity to fight against its Manichaean competitors. It might easily be a description of a genuine yang-yin relationship, a picture that comes closer to the actual truth than the Priviato Boni. Moreover, it does not damage monotheism in any way, since it unites the opposites just as yang and yin are united in Tao, which the Jesuits quite logically translated as God. It is as if Manichaeism, dualism, first made the fathers conscious of the fact that, until then, without clearly realizing it, they had always believed firmly in the substantiability of evil. This sudden realization might well have led them to dangerously anthropomorphic assumption that what man cannot unite, God cannot unite either. The early Christians, thanks to their greater unconsciousness, were able to avoid this mistake. Electricity, the data within and the lateral breath of life. Could what we identify as electrical energy be God? At the atomic level, light and frequency are all that we are. I believe that electricity is one of the expressions of the Holy Spirit. Right? The Holy Spirit is quite literally all of the protons in existence, all of them knit together into one big web. Right? That is the fabric of all creation. And in that lies the potentiality of change, and that lightning and electricity are expressions of that change occurring. So when you see lightning effect, it is the ionization being shown through the visual effect of the energy released by the changing of the elements from one into the other, from water vapor into separated oxygen and hydrogen, for example. That is an exothermic reaction that happens from the ionization, and that lightning is merely the expression of it that we see, right? The actual change creates the electrical energies, and so That, to me, electricity is the spirit being activated. And what we are seeing is merely the visible representation of that. In the exact same way that fire does the exact same thing as lightning, it is changing the butan into carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. It is a chemical change, and the light that we see is the exothermic reaction given form. It is the light being released by the change happening from the gas being burnt. We don't actually see the burn, we see the result of the burn. Perhaps we may risk the conjecture that the problem of the Yahwistic God image, which had been constellated in men's minds ever since the book of Job, continued to be discussed in Gnostic circles and in syncretic Judaisms generally, all the more eagerly as the Christian answer to this question, namely the unanimous decision in favor of God's goodness, did not satisfy the conservative Jews. In this respect, therefore, it is significant that the doctrine of the two antithetical sons of God originated with the Jewish Christians living in Palestine. Inside Christianity itself, the doctrine spread to the Bogomils and Cathars. In Judaism, it influenced religious speculation and found lasting expression in the two sides of the Kabbalistic tree of the Sephiroth, which were named Hesed, love, and Din, justice. A rabbinical scholar, Zvi Werblowski, has been kind enough to put together for me a number of passages from Hebrew literature which might have bearing on this problem. God's acknowledgement of the potential of man to choose false idols or other gods before him makes it seem as though there are more than one entity that exists in a form above that of the human form. But see, that right there is one of the major problems with the understanding that comes from those religions, because there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe that God gave that order. Right? There's no reason to believe that Moses existed. And if he did exist, he was not necessarily Jewish. He was probably Midianite. If he was indeed Jewish, it opens up a whole plethora of problems that are really not explained. How was his brother with him? How was his sister with him? Why did they go with him to Egypt in the way that they did? A lot of problems with that. But there is no reason to believe that God created the Ten Commandments whatsoever. There is plenty of reason to believe that it is a retroactive assertion that was placed to justify something that they wanted to have a justification for, right? There is no reason to believe, like, the Jewish law was not written by God. It was written by Moses at the direction of Jethro. The Ten Commandments is the only place that you can make that particular argument, that he went up the mountain, he was gone for 40 days, and he come back down with the Ten Commandments written in law or written on stone. It took God 40 days to write 10 commandments. Much more likely that it took 40 days for Moses to figure out what to write on the stones and to actually chisel it into the stones, not to mention making the stones themselves. Stonework is not easy unless you're God, and then you can literally just write on the wall while nobody's watching, and it's there, right? A lot of problems. A lot of problems. God is all. Any lesser God entity is a previous description of the singular illegitimate God. Yeah, right. And an incomplete description thereof. Right? Like I said, God exists outside of the creation. And so any attempts to limit him to anything inside of the creation is already limiting too far. Even putting the appellation he on it is going too far. Left hemisphere fixates on those separated classifications more than the shared ones. R. Joseph taught, what is the meaning of the verse? And none of you shall go out at the door of this house until the morning. Once permission has been granted to the destroyer, he does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Indeed, he even begins with the righteous, commenting in Exodus 33:5. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. The Midrash says, Yahweh means he could wax wroth for you, with you for a moment, for that is the length of his wrath, as is said in Isaiah. Hide yourselves for a little moment until the wrath is past, and destroy you. How anthropomorphic is it to say that not only does God get mad because he has no idea that you're going to do this thing, right? God has no idea whatsoever that you're going to make this choice, but he gets so mad because you actually make it that he has to separate himself from you so that he doesn't punish you, right? Until he calms down. And that's going to be within your lifetime. Right? How prideful is that statement? Like, that is so wild to me. Isn't what a rationalization? Like, I don't understand. Maybe you're talking about the hemisphere thing? All right. Yahweh gives warning here of unbridled irascibility. If in this moment of divine wrath a curse is uttered, it will indubitably be effective. I love this. That is why Balaam, who knows the thoughts of the Most High, was called upon by Balak to curse Israel, was so dangerous an enemy because he knew the moment of Yahweh's wrath. This particular example right here is one of the proof positives that the Bible is fabricated. This story is so wild, right? Balaam is a priest, and he is not a priest of Israel. He is separated from Israel. I think he may have been Midianite. I'm not entirely, recollection, not entirely sure of that, but he was not Israeli. And Balak was under threat of attack by this 600,000 fighting man army of the Israelites. And he calls on Balaam. And he says, hey, come here and curse these people for me. And Balaam makes an altar, right? 7 altars. And he makes 7 sacrifices on 7 altars. And then God comes to him and he asks God what to do. And God says, don't go. And he says, okay. And then he gets another request. And then he says, he takes it to God again. And this time God says, you can go, right? But only say what I tell you to say. And then he's on the road and he's riding on a donkey, right? He's riding his donkey down the road and the donkey stops. And he's like, what's wrong with the donkey? I don't see anything. There's nothing in the road. There's no snakes. There's no predators. There's absolutely no reason for this donkey to stop. But this donkey stopped. So he beats it in the head. I don't agree with beating animals, but that's what he did. And he made it move again, right? Now, then he gets a little bit farther down the road and the donkey stops again. And so he beats the donkey again because once again, there is nothing there. And then finally, this angel appears and is like, why are you beating the donkey? I'm like, he's like, because he stopped for no reason. He's like, well, you should assume that the donkey stopped because I am here. What? Right? Now, this angel is saying, don't go, right? The first angel said, don't go. The second, or the first God said, don't go. And then God shows up and says, go, but only say what I tell you to say. And then this one shows up, this God, he shows up and says, don't go. I told you not to go. And then there's another one. Then he says, go ahead and go, right? And then he sends him down the road and he goes and he's like, I'm not going to curse him. I'm going to bless him instead. And so he gives him a blessing. And he puts this blessing upon Israel and he goes away. And then the king's not happy. And he's like, I want you to do this again. So he takes it again in prayer. And again, he's got this argument between these angels of whether to do it or not. And he does it. And it's again, he blesses Israel. He refuses to curse them. And then you know what his reward for that is? For following the will of God, not to curse Israel. You know what his reward was for that? Him and his entire people were wiped out by Israel for, reasons. That's an amazing story, is it not? God directly contradicting himself 7 or 8 times within 3 chapters of a singular book. God himself contradicting himself repeatedly to the point of violence upon some poor innocent animal. Right? And then he doesn't appear to the man and say, stop. He appears to the donkey. And you're just supposed to assume that the donkey stopped because there's an angel, right? Makes no sense. No sense considered outside of the lens of, well, it's a Bible story, so it's got to be true, right? This right here is one of those soapbox things because it is absolutely ridiculous to believe that any particular part of this story is true in the slightest way whatsoever. right? The God of Israel appeared to a priest of not Israel after committing sacrifices built upon upon the high place, not just one, but multiple sacrifices, right? So much intrinsically wrong with the what's supposed to be fundamental understanding of the religion. It makes no sense whatsoever. How does one identify what the will of God is? The betterment of mankind at all times. I mean, choosing betterment of self and mankind, not in a greedy way, but in a true, actual way, is the will of God. That is my rationalization of that. Through morality, objective morality. I tend to get caught up in the nuance and detail that the serpent would advise to avoid. Yeah. Fear mongering baked into that story so much. Like it is so like I think I got a whole chapter just on that. All right. God's love and mercy are named his right hand, but his justice and his administration of it are named his left hand. Thus we read in First Kings, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all of the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. The Midrash comments, is there a right and left on the high? This means that the intercessors stand on the right and the accusers on the left. The comment on Exodus, thy right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, thy right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy, runs. When the children of Israel perform God's will, they will make the left hand his right hand. When they do not do his will, they will make even the right hand his left hand. God's left hand dashes to pieces, his right hand glorious to save. The dangerous aspect of Yahweh's justice comes out in the following passage. Even so, said the Holy One, blessed be he. If I create the world on the basis of mercy alone, its sins will be great. But on the basis of justice alone, the world cannot exist. Hence, I will create it on the basis of justice and mercy, and may it then stand. The Midrash on Genesis, Abraham's plea for Sodom, says, Abraham speaking, if thou desirest the world to endure, there can be no absolute justice. While if thou desirest absolute justice, the world cannot endure. Yet thou wouldst hold the cord by both ends, desiring both the world and absolute justice. Unless thou foregoest a little, the world cannot endure. We're gonna have to call this one early. Yahweh refers the repentant sinners even to the righteous and protects them from his justice by covering them with his hand or by hiding them under his throne. I'm going to pick this one back up when we come back tomorrow right here. I have a prior obligation that I have to get to here in just a very short amount of time. And this was already going to be a very iffy one. We got about 10 pages left. That's probably about half an hour. That would be too long. And so I'm going to have to wrap it up. That is very generic. I am speaking to the hearing of the voice of God to be taken as guidance. I believe that both sides of that is the voice of God. So you have to, like, when you hear, right? We'll make it simple. Do your laundry or not, right? When you hear that, you know intrinsically whether you actually need to stay and rest for a few minutes, right? Take a little bit of time. You can do your laundry a little bit later, right? Or if it is a more pressing thing, even then, sometimes rest can take precedence. But you hear a voice that is telling you need to do your laundry or just sit around and watch Netflix. More often than not, the betterment of you and everyone around you is going to be for you to wash your clothes so you don't smell and that is no biological hazard, right? That is going to be the good option most of the time, almost all of the time. There is, however, going to be the rare exceptions to that where you need to take a little bit of time to yourself for rest and recuperation. You're just too exhausted to deal with the laundry right now, right? That's not necessarily choosing evil, right? But it's not necessarily choosing the betterment of you, right? The betterment of you is almost always going to be to choose clothing, right? Cleanness. That is for the betterment. That is the choice. When it comes down to a choice of you can't have these things, that is wrong, Or if it's a choice of I want all of the things, that is wrong. The choice is going to be so so well diligent that you are rewarded with things and willing to share them with others, right? That is alignment for the betterment. That is the betterment for you. And you're not just generous or giving away to charity with no real reason and enabling somebody who won't work, but you're being generous to the people who need the help, right? That is choosing the betterment. Every single choice that you make has that matrix, even if it is as simple as sitting on your ass instead of doing your laundry. Now, in a certain situation, sitting on your ass and not doing your laundry can be good, but for the most part, it's not. And if you are sitting around intentionally choosing to watch Netflix instead of doing your laundry repeatedly, you are not choosing for the betterment. You are acting against the will of God in your life because He wants the best for you. Now, He wants the best for you. That is a rationalization. That is me being prideful. That is me asserting upon the divine characteristics that I would like to define in the divine. And so you can absolutely call it hypocritical. You can. I am not opposed to even you doing so. I mean, my beliefs are my beliefs, and you don't have to hold my beliefs. You don't have to come into accordance with my beliefs, but I do like to clearly express them. I do like to talk about them in somewhat great detail because it is enjoyable for me. And I do believe that it is all explainable by rationality, that you can point by point go through each and every single one of these choices and come to the right decision. Sometimes it can be a little bit murky, but normally, if it's being murky, it's because you don't want it to be the real right thing, even if it is. Yeah. My inner monologue weighing the options is not God, in my opinion. And you are welcome to that opinion. I disagree entirely with that, but you are welcome to it. What do you say of the argument that Jesus was a socialist? That is a very good argument that can be made, and I am not in disagreement with it. Uh, I am not of the opinion that you should sell all that you own and come and follow me. I don't. I believe that God put you here to have things, not all of the things, and not to place those things necessarily above the life of others. Right? If you are being stolen from, there's a whole argument that needs to be made and decided upon individually at the moment. Right? I'm not necessarily wanting to manifest that into my life or anything, so I'm not focusing on that. But there is very good argument to be made that Jesus was a socialist. Joseph was, right? That's exactly what Joseph did. Joseph took, right, under the guise of the state, the means of production entirely to himself. Then he took the free will and determination of an entire people entirely to himself, and he maintained that as the state, fully in charge of the means of production for the entirety of his life. He enacted socialism. So, yeah, the argument would actually be more that Jesus is a communist than a socialist because the difference between communism and socialism is the head, right? Both of them are a completely controlled market. The difference is who is making the decisions in the market. A socialist has one person, generally speaking. It might be a committee, but communism, in its truest form, doesn't have any one person. There's not even really a chairman in true communism. It is all of the people making the decisions all of the time. One of those reasons why it is absolutely impossible to enact upon the mortal coil. And so the argument isn't that Jesus was a socialist, it is more that he was a communist. He didn't really believe in the overarching powers. He didn't believe in the government. Give it to Caesar, it's his. Doing laundry would give serotonin and that helps calm the left hemisphere. That is true as well. But that's where I'm going to wrap that up. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment, not too much confusion to some somewhat difficult topics. I understand I do hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. I don't have a whole lot to add. We did fairly well. Like we didn't get through it. I thought we would, but we was pushing it. It was right at 60 pages. That's well over 2 hours by itself. So If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment, whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. If you put it in the box and it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you have truly found value, I ask that you hit the super thanks. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of one of my books where I discuss almost all of this in much greater detail. Or you can reach out to me through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been pittstake. Peace. And yes, all of that is a rationalization as well. I say that every time as a positive affirmation for my crew, but that is just me anthropomorphizing God in the exact same way that we were talking about earlier. So y'all have a blessed. I will be here tomorrow, 8 to 10 Central Time. Much love.